The rain was relentless, hammering down on the windshield like 1,000 tiny fists. The wipers struggled to keep up, swiping back and forth at full speed, but still, visibility was poor. Jason gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. The old highway was nearly deserted, stretching out like an endless black ribbon through the night, illuminated only by the dim glow of his headlights. It was the kind of night that felt like it would never end. Jason had been on the road for hours, trying to make it to his sister's house a few towns over. It was supposed to be a quick drive, but the unexpected storm had slowed him down. Now, it was well past midnight, and the GPS on his phone kept cutting out. With nothing but the hiss of rain and the drone of the engine to keep him company, Jason was starting to feel the fatigue set in. As he rounded a curve, the faint glow of a figure appeared on the side of the road. A person? Out here in this storm? Jason squinted, trying to get a better look. It was indeed a person, a woman, drenched from head to toe, her dark hair plastered to her face. She stood on the shoulder, one hand feebly raised in a gesture of desperation. Jason hesitated. He'd heard all the stories about picking up strangers, but something about her seemed different. Maybe it was the sheer hopelessness in her stance, or the fact that leaving someone out here in the middle of nowhere felt too cruel. Against his better judgment, he slowed the car and pulled over. As the passenger side window rolled down, the woman leaned in, her eyes shadowed beneath the drenched hood of her coat. "Can I get a ride?" Her voice was soft, barely audible over the sound of the rain. Jason nodded. "Hop in." The woman slipped into the seat, closing the door with a heavy thud. For a moment, the car was filled with the damp smell of rain-soaked earth. Jason glanced at her, but she was already turned away, staring out the window. The only sound was the rhythmic patter of rain against the car roof. "Where are you headed?" he asked, trying to make conversation. "Just ahead," she replied vaguely. Her voice was distant, almost hollow. Jason shrugged, figuring she must be exhausted or in shock. He decided not to press her for details. The road stretched on, and they drove in silence for what felt like hours, the rain never letting up. Every now and then, Jason stole glances at his passenger. Her clothes were old-fashioned, the kind you'd expect to see in a black and white photograph. He thought it was odd, but said nothing. After a while, he started to feel a chill in the air, as if the temperature in the car had dropped several degrees. He turned the heater up, but it did little to dispel the cold. The woman remained still, her eyes fixed on something unseen beyond the glass. Finally, a gas station sign appeared in the distance, its flickering neon lights a welcome sight. Jason pulled off the highway, thinking he could use a coffee to wake himself up. He turned to ask the woman if she needed anything, but she was gone. The passenger seat was empty. Jason slammed on the brakes, his heart hammering in his chest. There was no way she could have gotten out. He hadn't even heard the door open. His mind raced, trying to rationalize what just happened. Maybe she had slipped out when he wasn't looking, but how? And why didn't he hear anything? Confused and shaken, he parked by the gas station and stumbled inside. The clerk, an older man with a grizzled beard, looked up from his newspaper. "You all right there, buddy? You look like you've seen a ghost," he said with a half smile. Jason took a deep breath and recounted the story, hoping to make some sense of it. The clerk's expression grew grim, and he nodded slowly. "You're not the first to pick her up," the old man said. "That woman died on this highway over 20 years ago. Some say she still tries to get home, especially on nights like this." Jason felt the blood drain from his face. He stumbled back outside, his hands trembling as he fumbled for his keys. He quickly got back into his car, determined to leave that place behind. As he pulled back onto the highway, the rain seemed to ease up slightly, almost as if the storm had been satisfied. But Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he was still being watched. Every time he glanced in the rearview mirror, he half expected to see her sitting there, her dark eyes staring back at him. But there was nothing. The rest of the drive was a blur, the road unfurling endlessly before him. When he finally reached his sister's house and staggered inside, soaked and exhausted, the sun was just beginning to rise. But for the rest of his life, every time it rained, Jason couldn't help but remember that chilling ride and wonder if, somewhere out there, she was still waiting for another unsuspecting driver to pick her up. End of Chapter 1. The sound of rain continues, fading slowly to a gentle, calming rhythm to help the listener relax and drift off to sleep. Then Mark called down, "There's nothing here." His voice was steady but tinged with something, relief maybe, or perhaps a hint of doubt. Emily exhaled, her tension easing slightly. But just as she was about to turn away, she heard it again, that unmistakable sound of footsteps. This time they were heavier, more deliberate, and coming from directly above her. "Mark," she called, her voice quivering. "I hear it again!" Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. There was a silence so thick it pressed against her ears. Then a blood-curdling scream echoed from the attic. Without thinking, Emily rushed up the stairs, fear tightening her chest. She burst through the attic door to find Mark standing there, his flashlight beam shaking as he pointed it toward the far corner. Emily followed his gaze. There, half buried beneath a pile of old boxes, was a door they had never noticed before, small and almost invisible against the far wall. The door was slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. "What the hell?" Mark whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding rain. Emily's mind was racing. How could they have missed this door during all the times they had gone through the attic? The house was old, yes, but they had been through every inch of it. Or so they had thought. Mark approached the door, pushing it open with the end of his flashlight. It creaked ominously, revealing a narrow, dust-covered room that smelled of mildew and something far worse, something rotten. The air was so cold, it sent shivers down Emily's spine. Inside the hidden room, they found old furniture covered with sheets, tattered books, and strange markings on the walls. But the thing that caught Emily's eye was a set of dusty footprints leading from the door to the far corner of the room. Footprints that seemed to stop abruptly, as if whoever made them had simply vanished. "What is this place?" Mark muttered, shining his flashlight around. "I don't remember this on the house plans." Before Emily could respond, the temperature in the room plummeted even further. Their breath fogged in front of them, and a whispering sound filled the air, like the rustle of leaves or voices. Emily turned to Mark, her eyes wide with terror. "Let's get out of here," she said urgently. But just as they turned to leave, the door to the hidden room slammed shut with a deafening bang. The flashlight flickered and went out, plunging them into total darkness. For a moment, all they could hear was the rain hammering against the roof. Then, from somewhere in the darkness came the sound of slow, dragging footsteps, footsteps that were getting closer. Emily's scream was drowned out by a clap of thunder as something cold and unseen brushed against her arm. End of Chapter 2. The sound of rain intensifies, then gradually softens to a gentle, calming rhythm as the story fades, allowing the listener to relax and drift into sleep. The rain drummed steadily against the roof of the old house, a rhythmic lullaby that echoed through its dusty halls. Tonight the storm was especially fierce, with flashes of lightning illuminating the darkened rooms in brief, strobe-like bursts. Emily stood by the window, watching the rain cascade down in sheets, obscuring the world beyond. It had been 2 months since she, her husband Mark, and their 2 children moved into this old colonial house, tucked away at the edge of town. From the outside, the house was charming, a piece of history nestled among tall, swaying trees. But inside, it was far from perfect. Creaky floorboards, drafty windows, and a basement that seemed perpetually damp, no matter the weather. But the one thing Emily couldn't shake was the attic. From the moment they moved in, she felt something off about it. It started small, the occasional sound of something shifting or the soft creak of wood, which they attributed to the house settling. But every time it rained, the noises seemed to grow louder. At first, Mark brushed it off, reassuring Emily it was just the wind, or perhaps a squirrel that had made its way inside. But deep down, Emily knew it was something more. Tonight, the rainstorm was one of the heaviest they had experienced since moving in. Emily tried to shake off her unease as she tucked their two kids, Olivia and Max, into bed. She kissed their foreheads, her hands lingering for a moment longer than usual, as if to draw some comfort from their peaceful faces. As she closed their door, she heard it again, a faint creaking sound coming from above. She paused, holding her breath, her ears straining. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, like the slow, measured footsteps of someone pacing back and forth. Her heart began to race, but she forced herself to breathe. "It's just the wind," she told herself. Mark was already in bed, scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the world around him. Emily stood in the doorway, debating whether to mention the noises again. She knew what he would say, that it was her imagination running wild, spurred on by the storm. "Do you hear that?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Hear what?" "Footsteps from the attic." He sighed and set his phone down. "Emily, we've been through this. It's just the old wood expanding and contracting with the humidity." But just as he said it, there was a distinct sound, a heavy thud directly above their bedroom. Mark's eyes widened. For the first time, he looked genuinely concerned. "All right," he muttered, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. "I'll check it out." Emily grabbed his arm. "Be careful." With a quick nod, Mark grabbed a flashlight from the closet and headed toward the attic stairs. Emily stood at the base of the steps, her heart hammering in her chest as she watched him disappear into the darkness. The sound of his footsteps echoed above her, the old wooden stairs creaking under his weight. She listened intently, the flashlight beam flickering in the gaps between the floorboards above. For a few minutes, there was nothing but the sound of rain pounding against the roof. The rain was coming down in torrents, each drop like a pinprick against the dense canopy of the forest. The trees swayed ominously, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky as if they wanted to tear open the clouds. Sam and Tyler trudged along the muddy trail, their backpacks heavy with water and their boots squelching with every step. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway, a camping trip to unwind from their stressful jobs. But now, lost in the woods with darkness closing in, it felt like a terrible idea. "This doesn't look like the map," Tyler grumbled, wiping rain from his eyes and trying to shield the crumpled, soggy paper with his hands. Sam squinted through the downpour. "I swear we were on the right path. Maybe the storm threw us off." The wind howled in response as if mocking them. They had been wandering for hours, the once familiar trail now swallowed by shadows and mist. The storm had turned the forest into a maze, with landmarks they thought they recognized vanishing into the dark like ghosts. "Look, we need to find shelter," Sam said, shivering. "It's getting too dark to see, and we're already soaked to the bone." Tyler nodded reluctantly. Just as they were about to turn back, Sam's flashlight caught a glimmer through the trees. A few yards away, barely visible through the rain, was the outline of a small cabin. "Do you see that?" Sam whispered. Tyler's eyes widened. "That wasn't there before, was it?" Sam shook his head, uncertain. But they didn't have much choice. The cold was seeping into their bones, and they couldn't keep wandering aimlessly through the storm. They made their way toward the cabin, pushing through the underbrush, their hearts racing with a mixture of hope and unease. Inside the cabin looked old, its wooden exterior weathered and covered in moss. The door was slightly ajar, creaking softly as the wind pushed against it. Sam hesitated, his instincts telling him to turn back, but Tyler pushed past him. "Let's just get out of this rain," Tyler said, stepping inside. Sam followed, his flashlight beam revealing a single, dimly lit room. It was sparsely furnished with a dusty table, 2 rickety chairs, and a fireplace that had clearly not been used in years. Oddly enough, there was no sign of decay or rot, despite the cabin's apparent age. It was as if it had been frozen in time. Tyler set his backpack down with a sigh of relief. Finally, some shelter. He turned to Sam. "I'll try to get a fire going." Sam nodded, still uneasy. The air inside the cabin was musty, with a faint, unpleasant odor that he couldn't quite place. He shone his flashlight around the room, noticing strange carvings etched into the wooden walls. Spirals, symbols, and shapes that seemed to twist and shift in the flickering light. They looked ancient, almost ritualistic. "Hey, Tyler," Sam called. "Do you see these markings? They're weird." Tyler glanced up from the fireplace, where he was attempting to ignite some old dry logs. Probably just some old woodsman's scribbles. "We'll be out of here by morning." But something about the symbols made Sam's skin crawl. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The storm outside seemed to intensify, the wind howling like a chorus of distant screams. As the rain pounded against the cabin walls, he thought he heard whispers, faint, indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. He turned to Tyler. "Did you hear that?" Tyler frowned. "Hear what?" Before Sam could answer, a loud thud echoed from the back of the cabin, as if something heavy had fallen or been thrown. The sound sent a jolt of fear through both men. "What the hell was that?" Tyler whispered, his face pale. Sam tightened his grip on the flashlight, pointing it toward the far end of the room. "There's got to be a back room or something. Stay close." The two men moved cautiously toward the sound, their footsteps creaking on the old wooden floor. At the back of the cabin, they found a door partially hidden behind a dusty curtain. Sam pushed it open, revealing a narrow hallway that shouldn't have been there. The cabin was small. From the outside, it didn't look like it could contain more than one room. Yet, here they were, staring into a passageway that seemed to stretch impossibly far. "This doesn't make sense," Tyler muttered. The hallway was lit by a faint, eerie glow. As they stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply, their breath visible in the cold, damp air. The walls were covered in the same strange carvings, the symbols glowing faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. "Let's turn back," Sam said, his voice quivering. But when they turned around, the door to the main room was gone. The hallway stretched behind them now, endless in both directions. Panic set in. "This isn't possible," Tyler yelled, banging on the walls. "We came through here." The whispers grew louder, now more distinct, like dozens of voices whispering in a language neither of them could understand. Sam's flashlight began to flicker, casting frantic shadows that danced along the walls. The carvings seemed to shift and move, the symbols twisting into grotesque faces that leered at them. "Run!" Sam screamed, grabbing Tyler's arm. They sprinted down the hallway, the whispers turning into shrieks. The air grew thicker, like they were wading through water. The floor beneath them felt as if it were swaying, and the walls seemed to close in, as though the cabin itself was alive, trying to trap them. Just as they thought they were about to be swallowed by the darkness, they burst through a doorway and found themselves back in the main room. The storm outside had stopped, the air suddenly calm and still. They stumbled out of the cabin, gasping for breath, only to find themselves standing in an empty clearing. The cabin was gone. They looked around frantically. The trees were the same, the muddy trail they had followed still visible. But where the cabin had stood, there was nothing but wet grass and fallen leaves. It was as if the building had never existed. Did that just happen?" Tyler asked, his voice trembling. Sam didn't answer. He couldn't. The rain began to fall again, softly this time, as if the storm had been nothing more than a dream, but they both knew better. As they stumbled back to the trail, desperate to put distance between them and that cursed place, neither of them noticed the faint footprints that appeared in the mud behind them, prints that led straight from where the cabin had vanished. The small seaside village of Harper's Point was shrouded in mist, with the storm turning the once picturesque harbor into a turbulent cauldron of crashing waves. The sky was a dull gray, darkening by the minute, as though night was falling early. The rain poured relentlessly, soaking the narrow cobblestone streets and battering the windows of the old fishermen's cottages. The town was eerily quiet, most of the villagers having already taken shelter from the worsening storm. Nathan, a local fisherman, stood by the docks, his yellow raincoat plastered to his body by the wind. He had lived in Harper's Point all his life, and no storm had ever kept him from his evening routine. But tonight felt different. There was an electric tension in the air, a heavy stillness that pressed down on everything. It was the kind of weather that stirred up old legends, the kind that whispered of the sea's long-buried secrets. Nathan tugged his hood tighter around his face and glanced toward the water. The waves crashed violently against the rocks, sending up plumes of salty spray. His boat, the Sea Whisper, bobbed in the harbor like a toy, straining against its moorings. He was about to turn back toward the warmth of his home when he heard it, a faint voice calling his name. Nathan! He froze. The voice was barely audible over the howl of the wind, but it was unmistakable. It sounded like someone crying out from the sea. Nathan squinted through the sheets of rain, his heart pounding. At first, he saw nothing but the churning waves and the ghostly fog that clung to the water's surface. But then, just beyond the rocks, he caught a glimpse of something, a shadowy figure, half hidden by the mist. "Help me, Nathan!" The voice called again, more urgent this time. Without thinking, Nathan untied his boat, adrenaline overriding any sense of caution. It wasn't unusual for fishermen to get stranded in storms like this, and he couldn't leave someone to drown. As the boat rocked beneath him, he gunned the engine and steered toward the source of the cries. The rain was relentless, a curtain of water that seemed to blur the line between the sea and sky. Every time a flash of lightning lit up the horizon, he searched for that figure, but it always seemed to vanish before he could focus on it. The voice, however, never stopped calling his name, sometimes seeming to come from his left, then suddenly from his right, as if the storm itself were playing tricks on him. "Nathan, come closer." The voice was softer now, almost melodic, like a song carried on the wind. As he pushed farther out into the open water, Nathan began to realize something strange. The voice calling his name, it was familiar. It reminded him of someone he used to know. His mind raced as memories of his childhood surfaced. A friend who had drowned in these very waters nearly 30 years ago. "Tommy?" Nathan whispered, disbelief and terror battling in his mind. He shook his head. It couldn't be. Tommy had been lost at sea all those years ago. His body never recovered. And yet the voice had the same tone, the same lilt. But now it was tinged with something darker, something that sent chills down Nathan's spine. "Come to me, Nathan." As he pushed farther out into the storm, the sea grew rougher, the waves slamming against the side of the boat with enough force to nearly capsize it. But Nathan pressed on, driven by some primal instinct to follow the voice. Then, through the swirling mist, he saw it. A ship. But it wasn't just any ship. Its massive, rotting hull loomed out of the fog, barnacles and seaweed clinging to its sides. The sails were tattered, flapping uselessly in the howling wind. It was a ghostly vessel, one that looked like it had been lost to the sea centuries ago. Nathan's heart nearly stopped. He had heard stories of the Lady of the Deep, a ship that had vanished without a trace during a storm much like this one, leaving only whispers of its doomed crew. The voice was louder now, almost deafening. "Join us, Nathan." Nathan's boat drifted closer to the ghost ship, as if pulled by an invisible current. He could see figures on the deck now, shadowy shapes that moved like they were trapped in a slow, eternal dance. Lightning flashed again, and he caught a glimpse of their faces. Hollow eyes, skin stretched tight over skeletal frames, their mouths open in silent screams. They were the crew of the Lady of the Deep, forever lost at sea, damned to roam the waters for eternity. Nathan's terror reached its peak, but his body refused to obey. The haunting voices seemed to pull him in, whispering secrets that no living man was meant to hear. His hands, almost moving on their own, reached for the rope ladder dangling from the ship's side. He had to know, had to see if Tommy was really there. But as his fingers brushed the slick, decayed wood of the ladder, the whispering stopped. The storm seemed to pause, the air heavy with an unnatural silence. Then, with a force that nearly knocked him off his feet, the sea beneath him roared to life. A wave as tall as a building surged up, slamming into Nathan's boat and sending it spinning. He lost his grip on the ladder and tumbled into the icy water. For a moment, everything was chaos. The cold enveloped him, the salt stinging his eyes. He struggled to the surface, gasping for breath, only to find the ghost ship gone. There was no sign of it, just the endless, dark expanse of the sea and the distant glow of the village lights. The storm had calmed to a drizzle, the thunder now a distant rumble. Nathan frantically scanned the horizon, but the Lady of the Deep had vanished, as if it had never been there. Exhausted, he managed to haul himself back into his boat, shivering uncontrollably. He steered back to shore, his mind reeling. Had it all been a hallucination, a trick of the storm? But as he tied up his boat and stumbled onto the dock, something cold and heavy in his pocket caught his attention. Pulling it out, he stared in horror. It was an old, rusted compass, one that he recognized instantly. It had belonged to Tommy, the very same compass they had played with as children. How it ended up in his pocket was a question he would never be able to answer. From that night on, Nathan was never the same. He stopped going out to sea, the fear of what he had seen or thought he had seen haunting him. Every time it stormed, he could swear he heard the whispers again, calling his name from the depths. And in the darkest hours of the night, when the rain beat against his windows, he would wake in a cold sweat, convinced he could hear Tommy's voice, begging him to join him on the ghostly ship that roamed the endless, unforgiving sea. The rain lashed against the windows of the old Ravenwood Hotel, a Victorian-era building that stood like a forgotten sentinel on the outskirts of town. The storm had come out of nowhere, the skies darkening with a sudden fury that sent tourists and locals alike scrambling for cover. Inside the grand lobby, the chandelier flickered as a bolt of lightning illuminated the old stained-glass windows, casting eerie shadows across the tiled floor. Claire was exhausted. After a long day of traveling and a canceled flight, she had finally managed to find a room at the only hotel that still had vacancies. She didn't care that it was old and musty, or that the front desk clerk had given her a strange look when he handed her the key to room 713. "Are you sure you want that one, miss?" the clerk had asked, hesitating. "We do have other rooms." But Claire was in no mood to be picky. She just wanted a hot shower and a good night's sleep. She waved off his concern and made her way up the grand staircase, which creaked ominously with every step. The air seemed to grow colder as she reached the 7th floor, the lights dimming as if struggling against the storm outside. When she reached room 713, the brass numbers glinted dully in the faint light. The door was old and scuffed, and the key stuck in the lock for a moment before finally turning with a reluctant click. Claire pushed it open, stepping into the darkness beyond. Inside room 713, the room was larger than she expected, furnished with antique pieces that looked like they had been there since the hotel was first built. Heavy velvet drapes covered the windows, and the air carried a faint scent of dampness and decay. The rain outside seemed to intensify as she closed the door behind her, shutting out the world. Claire flicked on the lights, which buzzed softly before casting a dim, yellowish glow. She set her suitcase down and tried to relax. The room was chilly, so she turned the thermostat up, hoping to chase away the damp cold that seemed to cling to her bones. After a long, hot shower, she felt somewhat rejuvenated. She wrapped herself in a towel and moved to the window, pulling back the heavy drapes. The view was disappointing, just an alleyway below, filled with puddles that reflected the stormy sky. She sighed and let the drapes fall back into place, then slipped into bed, hoping to get some rest before her early flight in the morning. But as soon as she turned off the lights, the room seemed to take on a life of its own. The rain drummed against the windows with a fury that matched her racing heartbeat. Claire pulled the covers up to her chin, willing herself to sleep. But that's when she heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping on the window. Her eyes snapped open, and her pulse quickened. She tried to tell herself it was just a branch, or maybe something caught in the wind. But the tapping was too deliberate, too steady. She turned on the bedside lamp, the dim light barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. The tapping stopped immediately, leaving only the sound of the rain. Taking a deep breath, She got out of bed and slowly approached the window. The room was on the 7th floor, so it was impossible for anyone to be outside. As she drew back the curtain, her breath caught in her throat. The window was fogged up from the inside, and there, written in the condensation, were the words, "Let me in." Claire's scream caught in her throat, her mind racing. She wiped the message away with her sleeve, convinced she was imagining things. Maybe the steam from her shower had caused the fog, and she was just overtired. But as she backed away, she heard the tapping again. Louder this time, more insistent. Tap, tap. Grabbing her phone, she dialed the front desk. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before a voice finally answered. "Front desk, how may I assist you?" I think someone's trying to get into my room," she stammered. "I'm in room 713. Can you send someone up, please?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, the clerk's voice, now tinged with something that sounded like pity, came back. "Miss, there's no one else on your floor. In fact, room 713 hasn't been occupied in years." "What are you talking about? I'm in the room right now." Claire snapped, her panic rising. "Miss, room 713 was sealed off after a guest had an incident," the clerk said hesitantly. "We don't rent that room anymore." The line went dead, replaced by a soft, static hum. Claire's hands were shaking now, her mind reeling. She backed away from the phone, her eyes darting around the room. It felt colder than ever, like the air itself was leaching the warmth from her skin. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into total darkness. The tapping at the window grew louder, almost frantic now, accompanied by a low whispering that seemed to seep from the walls. "Let me in." The sound was coming from all around her, like a chorus of voices overlapping, rising and falling in a sickening chant. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled toward the door, her fingers fumbling for the handle. But no matter how hard she twisted, the door wouldn't budge. It was as if it had been locked from the outside. Panic gripped her. She turned back toward the window, and her blood ran cold. There, standing on the other side of the glass, was a figure, a pale face with hollow eyes staring directly at her. The lips moved soundlessly, mouthing the same words over and over. "Let me in." Suddenly, the window shattered inward, the cold air rushing in like a tidal wave. Claire screamed, shielding her face from the shards of glass. The figure was gone, but the whispers remained, now louder than ever, filling the room with their relentless demands. In a last desperate attempt, she ran to the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind her. The whispers were muffled but still present, like something trying to claw its way through the walls. She backed into the corner, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her mind on the edge of breaking. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything went silent. The whispers stopped, the cold air dissipated, and the rain outside softened to a gentle drizzle. Cautiously, Claire opened the bathroom door, expecting to find the room in shambles. But it was exactly as she had left it. The window was intact, the bed neatly made, and her suitcase sitting by the door. Confused, she hurriedly gathered her things and fled the room, not daring to look back. As she reached the lobby, the clerk gave her a knowing, sorrowful look but said nothing. She didn't bother to check out. She just wanted to get as far away from the hotel as possible. The next morning, as the sun finally broke through the clouds, Claire returned to the hotel, determined to demand an explanation. But when she arrived, the building was boarded up, abandoned, as if it had been vacant for years. There was no sign of life, no sign that anyone had stayed there the night before. Room 713 was gone, just like the whispers that haunted her dreams for years to come. The old house stood at the end of a long, gravel driveway, surrounded by a forest that seemed to swallow it whole. Rain poured steadily from the darkening sky, creating a mist that wrapped around the gnarled trees like ghostly fingers. Anna and her husband David had recently purchased the property, eager for a fresh start in the countryside after the chaos of city life. The house was a fixer-upper, to be sure, but it had charm. At least that's what they told themselves as they unpacked in the cold, damp air. The previous owners had left behind a jumble of old furniture and boxes in the attic. The realtor had brushed it off, claiming they had been too old to move everything. But to Anna, the clutter was part of the house's mysterious allure. It was like stepping into another time, exploring the dusty remnants of someone else's life. A week after moving in, on a rainy Saturday afternoon, Anna decided to tackle the attic. She climbed the narrow staircase, the wooden steps creaking under her weight. The attic was dimly lit by a single bulb, its weak light barely cutting through the shadows. As she sorted through the piles of forgotten items, she came across an old, wooden chest tucked into a corner. It was covered in dust, the hinges rusted with age. Curious Anna forced it open with a bit of effort. Inside, wrapped in layers of yellowed linen, was a doll. It was unlike any she had ever seen, about a foot tall, with porcelain skin so pale it was almost ghostly. Its eyes were a piercing blue, staring straight ahead with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. The doll wore a delicate, old-fashioned lace dress, now discolored with age, and its black hair was pulled back into tight ringlets. "Creepy little thing," Anna muttered to herself. She was about to put it back when she noticed something carved into the base of the doll's foot. Margaret, 1912. "What's that?" David's voice made her jump. He had come up to check on her. "Just a doll," she said, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. "I think it's from the early 1900s. Kind of eerie, isn't it?" David shrugged. "Weird, but it might be worth something. Maybe an antique collector would want it." For reasons she couldn't explain, Anna decided to keep the doll. She placed it on a shelf in the guest room, thinking it would add a touch of vintage charm. But that night, as the storm intensified, bringing with it howling winds and torrential rain, strange things began to happen. The first night, unexplained noises. Anna woke to the sound of soft giggling in the middle of the night. It was faint, barely audible over the storm outside, but unmistakable. She sat up, straining her ears. The laughter was coming from the direction of the guest room. "David, wake up," she whispered, shaking him. David groaned and rolled over. "It's just the wind, Anna. Go back to sleep." But Anna couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. She tiptoed down the hall, her heart pounding in her chest. As she reached the guest room, the giggling stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of the rain pelting against the windows. She opened the door slowly, half expecting to find someone inside. But the room was empty, the doll sitting exactly where she had left it, its unblinking eyes staring directly at the door as if it had been waiting for her. Shaking her head, she scolded herself for being silly and went back to bed. But as she drifted off, she could have sworn she heard a faint whisper, "Play with me." The second night, the moving doll. The next morning, Anna convinced herself that the noises were just her imagination. But when she walked into the guest room to dust, she froze. The doll had moved. It was no longer on the shelf, but was instead sitting on the bed, its legs dangling over the side. "David, did you move the doll?" she called, trying to keep her voice steady. David came in frowning. "No, why would I? You're just imagining things. Maybe it fell over." But Anna knew better. There was no way the doll could have simply moved on its own, especially not to a sitting position. Still, she tried to push the thought from her mind. She placed the doll back on the shelf, making sure it was securely propped up, and left the room. That night the rain returned, hammering against the roof with renewed fury. Around midnight, they were both jolted awake by a loud thud coming from the guest room. Anna's heart was racing. This time David heard it too. "I'll check it out," he said, grabbing a flashlight. Anna followed him down the hall, gripping his arm tightly. The guest room door was ajar, and as they stepped inside, the beam of the flashlight revealed the doll lying face down in the middle of the floor. It was as if someone had thrown it there in a fit of rage. "Okay, that's it," David said, picking up the doll. "I'm getting rid of this thing." He stormed down the stairs and tossed it into a box in the garage. The third night, scratching and whispers. They thought that would be the end of it. But that night the sound started again, soft scratching like tiny fingers dragging against the walls. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Let me in, let me play." Anna and David tried to ignore it, but the sounds only intensified, now seeming to come from inside their bedroom walls. Desperate, they got out of bed, grabbing flashlights. As they entered the hallway, they were met with the sight of wet, muddy footprints leading from the garage all the way to the guest room. "Impossible," David muttered, his voice shaking. "We locked the garage door." With dread tightening in their chests, they opened the guest room door. There, sitting on the bed, was the doll. Its eyes seemed to gleam with malevolence in the dim light. The lace of its dress was soaked, dripping water onto the bedspread as if it had been outside in the rain. "I threw you out!" David shouted, grabbing the doll and flinging it against the wall. But as soon as it hit the ground, the whispers erupted into a cacophony, filling the house with ear-splitting cries. "You can't get rid of me! I'm part of this house now!" The lights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. The rain outside turned into a deafening roar, as if the storm itself was feeding off the chaos inside the house. The doll, lying on the floor, began to twitch, its limbs moving as if it were trying to stand up. "Run!" Anna screamed, grabbing David's hand. They bolted down the stairs, the whispers following them, growing louder and more desperate. They stumbled out into the rain, not stopping until they reached the safety of their car. As they drove away, the lights in the old house flickered back on, and through the rearview mirror, Anna could see the doll standing at the window, watching them leave. Epilogue: The return of the doll. The next day, they returned with a priest to cleanse the house. But when they entered the guest room, the doll was gone. The priest performed a blessing, assuring them that whatever presence had been there was now banished. Relieved, Anna and David tried to move on with their lives. But a week later, as they were unpacking a new delivery of groceries, Anna opened a box to find the doll sitting inside, its porcelain face cracked into a twisted grin. A note was tucked into its hand, written in the same childish scrawl. "You can't escape me. We'll play forever." The rain poured down in relentless sheets, drumming against the rooftops and turning the quiet suburban neighborhood into a sea of reflections. Streetlights cast a dim glow over the puddles, flickering occasionally as if struggling to stay alive. Sarah stood by her kitchen window, staring out at the storm-soaked street. The house was silent, save for the rhythmic sound of rain hitting the glass. It had been a long day, and she was grateful her 8-year-old son Ethan was finally asleep upstairs. Her husband Tom was out of town on a business trip, leaving her alone in their cozy but suddenly too empty house. As she sipped her tea, trying to unwind, something caught her eye. Across the street, barely visible through the downpour, stood a figure. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by the swaying branches of the large oak tree. But no, it was definitely a person. The figure was tall, dressed in what looked like a dark hooded coat, standing completely still, watching her house. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Who would be out there at this hour, in this weather? She leaned closer to the window, trying to get a better look, but the figure remained motionless, almost blending into the shadows. Feeling a chill crawl up her spine, she quickly pulled the curtains shut. "It's just your imagination," she told herself, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. Probably just a neighbor taking a walk. But as she turned to head upstairs, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The first encounter, strange footprints. The next morning, the storm had eased to a drizzle, but the sky remained overcast, as if the sun had forgotten how to shine. Sarah went outside to grab the newspaper and froze. There, on the rain-soaked driveway, were muddy footprints. They led from the street, right up to her front door, and then back again, as if someone had stood there, staring inside for who knows how long. A shiver of fear ran down her spine. She glanced around the quiet neighborhood, but there was no sign of anyone. The street was deserted, the houses dark and silent. Trying to brush off her anxiety, Sarah went back inside and locked the door behind her, double-checking the deadbolt. She told herself it must have been some prankster. But deep down, she couldn't shake the memory of the shadowy figure she had seen the night before. That night, as the rain returned with renewed intensity, the unease in Sarah's chest grew heavier. The second night, a knock at the window. As the storm raged outside, Sarah lay in bed, trying to sleep. The house creaked softly, the wind rattling the windows. Just as she was about to drift off, a sound jolted her awake, a soft but distinct tap. Tap, tap on the window by her bed. Her eyes flew open, her heart racing. She turned to look, but all she could see was the darkness beyond the rain-streaked glass. For a moment, she thought it might be a branch tapping against the window. But then the tapping came again, slow and deliberate, like someone was trying to get her attention. Swallowing her fear, she forced herself to get up and approach the window. She drew the curtains back slowly, her breath fogging up the glass as she leaned in to peer outside. There was nothing there, but just as she was about to close the curtains, lightning flashed, illuminating the street outside. For a split second, she saw it, the same shadowy figure standing across the street, staring directly at her. Its face was obscured, hidden beneath the hood, but she could feel its gaze boring into her. Sarah's blood ran cold. She stumbled back, pulling the curtains shut with trembling hands. She wanted to call the police, but what would she say? That someone was standing on the street, watching her house? They would think she was paranoid. The third night, the figure in the house. By the third night, Sarah was on edge. She made sure every door and window was locked, every curtain drawn. She tucked Ethan into bed, trying to hide her anxiety with a forced smile. "It's just another storm, sweetheart. You're safe," she reassured him. But as she settled into bed, the rain came down harder, and the house seemed to groan under the weight of the storm. Just as she was beginning to relax, she heard it again. The soft tapping. But this time it wasn't coming from the bedroom window. It was coming from downstairs. Her heart pounded in her ears. She grabbed the baseball bat Tom kept under the bed and crept down the stairs, each step creaking beneath her weight. As she reached the bottom, she noticed the faintest glow coming from the living room. The curtains were slightly ajar, swaying as if someone had just passed through them. She approached cautiously, holding her breath. But as she stepped into the living room, her blood ran cold. The front door was wide open, rain pouring in and pooling on the floor. The footprints were back, but this time they were fresh, leading from the open door toward the staircase. "Ethan!" she screamed, dropping the bat and racing upstairs. She burst into his room, only to find him still asleep, blissfully unaware. But as she turned to leave, she saw it. A shadowy figure standing at the end of the hallway, watching her with those same cold, unreadable eyes. The figure was closer now, inside her home. Gathering her courage, she charged down the hallway, ready to swing the bat, but the figure vanished, dissolving into the shadows as if it had never been there. Panting, she flipped on every light in the house, but there was no sign of an intruder. The final encounter, the unseen visitor. Unable to sleep, Sarah sat on the couch, clutching a mug of coffee with trembling hands. She kept all the lights on, waiting for the dawn. As the hours dragged on, the rain outside began to lighten, turning into a soft drizzle. But just when she thought it was over, she heard a voice, faint, almost a whisper. "Sarah, let me in." Her heart stopped. It was coming from the front door. Slowly she approached, her pulse racing. She looked through the peephole but saw nothing but darkness. The whisper came again, more insistent this time. "Let me in." She backed away, terror gripping her. Just as she turned to run, there was a sudden crash, the sound of glass shattering. She spun around to see the living room window had been broken, rain and wind pouring in. And then she saw it, the shadowy figure standing inside, inches away. This time she could see its face, or rather the lack of one. It was like staring into a void, a darkness so complete it seemed to suck the light out of the room. The figure reached out with a skeletal hand, its voice now a low, guttural whisper. "You invited me in." Sarah screamed, backing away until she was pressed against the wall. But just as the figure was about to reach her, the first rays of dawn broke through the storm clouds. The figure let out a hiss, retreating into the shadows and disappearing as the light flooded the room. Epilogue: The rain returns. The police arrived later that morning, responding to Sarah's frantic call. They found the broken window, the muddy footprints, and a woman on the edge of a nervous breakdown. But there was no evidence of an intruder. The neighbors claimed they hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. Sarah and Ethan left the house that day, moving in with her sister in another town, but the fear never really left her. And every time it rained, Sarah would find herself peering out the window, searching the shadows for that figure. Because deep down, she knew. It was still out there, waiting for the next stormy night, waiting for her to let her guard down. And she could still hear its whisper, echoing in the back of her mind. "Let me in, let me in."